Welcome to this session on how green stimulus measures could fuel the decarbonization of shipping. First of all, I hope that all of you are in good health and safety during this difficult time. I'm incredibly happy to see how many of you are able to join us today, especially those of you who are joining us in your very late evening or early morning, of which there are both some members of our panel today that are doing that, and I'm sure many of our participants as well. Thank you also to the World Economic Forum and to Friends of Ocean Action for giving us, the Getting to Zero Coalition, the opportunity to host this session during the virtual ocean dialogues. Throughout this week, the virtual ocean dialogues have convened leaders and communities from across the world to share and discuss their work and to advocate for urgent action for a healthy ocean. The Getting to Zero Coalition is one such community, and we are working together on an ambitious goal to have zero-emission vessels operating along deep-sea trade routes by 2030. We call it maritime shipping's moonshot ambition. The Getting to Zero Coalition is a partnership between the Global Maritime Forum, the World Economic Forum, and Friends of Ocean Action. And it brings together over 130 ambitious stakeholders from across the maritime, energy, infrastructure, financial sectors, and supported by key governments and IGOs. So my name is Johanna Kristoffersen. I'm the Managing Director of the Global Maritime Forum, one of the partners in the Getting to Zero Coalition, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's session. The objective of the session is to explore the impact of COVID-19 on shipping's decarbonization, in particular, how to construct recovery packages and other measures to put the sector on track to transition to a zero-emission future. Yesterday, some of our colleagues at the World Economic Forum called for a great reset, urging us to build back a more equal, inclusive and sustainable economy and society, and one that is more resilient in the face of the many global challenges that we will face over the coming years. I can't think of a better reminder that shipping's decarbonization must be done in a way that is equitable and that addresses the urgent needs of those that are at the forefront of the climate crisis. With that, I would like to give the floor to one such person, Minister Kabua, Minister Kitlang Kabua, Minister of Education, Sports and Training of the Marshall Islands, who is also the chair of the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport, and we are so honored to have you here today, Minister. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Joanna. Yahweh and greetings to you all around this precious planet from here in the Marshall Islands. It is a great pleasure to be with you today, and my sincere thanks to the organizers for setting up this unprecedented gathering during this pandemic, and for making sure that while we are all focused on this pandemic and the economic aftershock, we do so fully cognizant of the much larger crisis that we are also facing, which is the climate crisis. I'm honored to be asked to introduce this very critical session. For the Marshall Islands and all the other island states, shipping is a main lifeline. This pandemic has only reinforced just how critical a sector this is, more so in times of crisis. From this, we must insist that economic recovery that follows focuses and drives the transition to decarbonizing the major emitting sectors. For countries such as mine, heavily dependent on imported food, medicines, fossil fuels, in fact, all essential goods of every kind, shipping is our most important link to the world. These microeconomies peppering the world's greatest ocean have the longest, thinnest, and most expensive and most vulnerable transport lines there are in this area. This lifeline is currently totally dependent on fossil fuels. We need to change this now, and we need to make this change immediately. For the Marshall Islands, the issue is a top-down and bottom-up one, and we are heavily invested in the transition to decarbonize at both levels. At the global level, our national flag flies on some 9% of ships across the world's oceans. There is a heavy responsibility on my government to be a leader in the International Maritime Organization. We take this role very seriously, and for the past several years, we have been tirelessly championing a coalition of high ambition countries from the Pacific and around the world, calling for shipping to immediately begin all action needed to decarbonize consistent with a 1.5-degree target. Shipping is a major emitter, as was mentioned earlier. It must play a role alongside all the major emitters if we are to survive. The IMO, its member states, and the global industry is responding, but it must accelerate. As Cristina Figueres reminded us just last week, time is up. We no longer have 50 years, or even 10 years, to make the critical and hard decisions. They need to be made now. The response to COVID may be the world's last chance to invest in a decarbonized global future. It is now time to begin the serious debate on a carbon tax for shipping at IMO. This debate will not be an easy one. But as our late minister, Tony de Broom, was fond of telling us in Paris, we don't do easy. It is a debate that will test the maturity of both the IMO and the industry. The Marshall Islands is heavily invested politically and commercially, and the role of our registries will be critical. But it doesn't have to be an either-or debate. Responsible and ambitious decarbonization must be a win-win situation, not a zero-sum game. It has to benefit the planet and the industry. I was incredibly enheartened last week listening to the interview with BIMCO's first woman president. President Sadan is pledging her organization to continue shipping decarbonization regardless of the pandemic and its aftershocks. Of course, with women, there is no limit to what we can collectively achieve. And at the domestic level, it is critically important we continue our own measures to respond to this crisis. We cannot afford to be left behind. We must now also accelerate decarbonization of our own domestic shipping. Again, the Marshall Islands is striving to show leadership. Of course, it is not a task we can undertake alone. Working with leading international researchers from around the globe, we have launched the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport as a center of excellence to drive a Pacific transition to low carbon shipping. I want to particularly thank the International Academy for coming so willingly to our support, and of course the German government for responding so generously to our request to help make our center a success. Alongside with Fiji, we have announced our own domestic target for shipping of 100% reduction in emissions by 2050. 40% of this will be done by 2030. Again, with Fiji, we have established the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership, a call for an immediate investment of $500 million in blended financing to catalyze real shipping transition in 8 Pacific Island states. We need the help and partnership of international communities to make this happen at speed and scale. We ask that you not leave us behind on this historic journey. We want to come with you, not behind you. It's all about partnerships. And again, we are grateful to you, Joanna, and the Global Maritime Forum for inviting us to be a knowledgeable partner in Getting to Zero Coalition. We will do all we can to participate, and I look forward to hearing more about this forum in this panel today. Ladies and gentlemen, with these few remarks, I'll pass it back to our moderator, and I look forward with great interest to hearing from our esteemed panel. And if I may leave you all with this message, time is not our friend. We cannot afford to take our eye off the long game. We need the highest ambition, and we need the strongest partnerships. The Marshall Islands is proudly committed to getting to zero, leaving no one behind. Kumodala.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you so much for your remarks and for your leadership and your government's leadership, especially at the IMO, in international climate negotiations, but also specifically in the context of the Pacific Blue Partnership and your willingness to put yourselves forward for collaboration with other organizations such as ourselves. We very much appreciate that, and we look forward to working with you in that joint up endeavor. Earlier today, Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg made a reference to a recent commitment from the Norwegian ship owners, who are on a very similar journey to yours, I could say. It's at a different scale and different economic context, of course, but with a similar ambition and similar goals. And perhaps I could invite Lasse to talk about that shortly. Let me first introduce the panel. Let me start off with Lasse, who I just mentioned. Lasse Kristoffersen is the CEO of Torvald Klaveness, and until recently, just a few weeks ago, he was the chairman of the Norwegian Shipowners Association as well, and so has really led the effort to bring his fellow countrymen towards this collective ambitious goal. We are also joined by Randy Chen, Vice Chairman of One High Lines, a Taiwan-based container line, and also a member of the Global Maritime Forum's Board of Directors. We are furthermore joined by Otto Schacht, Executive Vice President of Sea Logistics at logistics provider Kühne Nagel, who similarly have set some ambitious goals for their operations. And finally, I welcome Gonzalo Muñoz, COP25 high-level champion and co-founder of TriCiclos. My apologies for the pronunciation. But of course, who is also working together in his capacity as COP25 high-level champion with his fellow high-level champion for the next round of climate negotiations that are due to take place next year, but for which there are considerable efforts already well underway, including on shipping decarbonization. I will invite each speaker to make a few opening remarks, and after which I'll moderate a discussion. As participants, I would encourage you to send in short questions in the chat format, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And then finally, I'll conclude the discussions towards the end. But we have a good 45 minutes for discussion, so I look forward to that. With that, Lasse, over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having us. And I guess your opening was why did we conclude on the strategy we did, and how did we do it? And I think the reason why we had this discussion and ended up at this conclusion in the Ship Owners Association is that partly because we think it's the right thing to do and a necessary thing to do, but we also think it's a smart thing to do. And to start with the right thing to do, we already have an ambition framework in IMO for decarbonization, but we realize that this is not as ambitious as the rest of the world. And even though we in our industry believe that this is very ambitious and maybe too ambitious, we are not the ones to decide. And we don't believe that the strategy put down in 2018 would stand untouched until 2050 with the changes we see around us, both in the discussions and the experiences, and also the expectations to do something. So we believe that we should look at the IMO strategy as a minimum, not the maximum. Having said that, if you look at the IMO strategy and take into account that the world will continue to develop, most likely, I mean, taking COVID aside, if we are growing world trade as much the next 30 years as we did the previous 30 years, that means that we in 2050, on a per ship basis, we need to reduce emissions by close to 90%. In other words, if you need to go to 90% reduction, you can as well go to 100% reduction, because we don't have any technology for that today. So on that basis, we concluded in the Ship Owners Association that if you want to continue to be a leading group in this industry, and for members to be leaders in their industry, you need to aim at zero in 2050. And we have kind of separated our efforts into two steps. One is a short-term energy efficiency, where we have an ambition by 2030 to reduce by 50%. And then we have said that we have an ambition to, from 2030, our members will only order zero-emission vessels. We have thirdly in our strategy that we will be to net zero all our members will be net zero in 2050. And on top of that, we are now promoting for IMO to introduce a ban on fossil fuel on seagoing vessels as of 2050. The last one is something that raises a lot of eyebrows, and you can question, why do we care about that today? Well, a vessel typically lives for 20 years. It takes a couple of years, and it takes a few years to build it. So if we are really here that we want to get to zero in 2050 and ban these vessels, that ban needs to come today, because the decisions made over the last couple, next couple of years will actually produce vessels that live beyond 2050. But if we produce that ban today, nobody will be left out, because nobody can really account for a vessel living beyond 20 years. So we're very firm on this, and we believe that our members and all our members think that this is in the short term a competitive advantage, and in the long term something we need to do because the society around us requires it.
Thank you, Lasse, and thank you for that detailed explanation. I think that's very helpful, especially around some of the specific policy asks that come alongside a commitment from your side. Yep. One thing that I might be curious, just if you could expand just briefly on, is, of course, from the time when you decided, or when you had the discussions within the Norwegian ship owners around the strategy, to when you actually publicized it, quite a lot happened. A global pandemic, amongst other things. And yes, to what extent did that affect the discussions? Did that factor in any way? And when you announced, how you announced, etc. But also
we realized that, first of all, the process internally in the association, we realized that this is quite a bold statement to make. And when we make statements in our association, we mean it. We just don't put them out there and say, it's an idea. We really mean it, and we should stand all behind it. So it took a couple of years of internal process to get everybody on board. And then we were just about to launch, and suddenly comes COVID, and all priorities changes. And we said, okay, as of now, there is no climate really to introduce something like this to the public. But then as we went through that COVID, more and more of the discussion said, okay, so let's make sure that we do not come out of this crisis in the same fashion as we went into it. And then we felt we really had a message to come through that, yes, we think there is a great opportunity by acting now on decarbonizing shipping. So then we decided maybe this is actually a perfect time to introduce our message, because now the discussion is, how do we use the measures we have in governments and in EUs and in other places to stimulate the economy, and then make sure you stimulate it towards decarbonization and green industries, not brown. So that's the thinking.
Okay, thank you very much. Randy, as an active participant in the Getting to Zero Coalition, you have particularly become involved in the discussions around how do we mobilize first movers, such as yourselves, frankly, around this table here today, or this virtual table. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that work and the work that you're doing within One High Lines, and then what, if any, impact you've seen from the pandemic on that work, on the goals that are set, and the kind of trajectory that we collectively need to travel on.
Sure, thank you, Johanna, and the rest of the World Economic Forum to give us this opportunity to participate in today's panel. To start with your first question about our involvement with the Getting to Zero Coalition, I think it's worth kind of taking a couple steps back, because most operators in our industry, that is the container shipping industry, from this part of the world, are not known for championing kind of new alternatives. We all know the same story about how shipping has traditionally dragged its feet with complying with regulation. But because of the scope of the issues that we're faced with in this particular challenge, we had a very significant discussion after engaging in several sessions with the Global Maritime Forum about not letting other entities, whether they be corporate, private sector corporate entities, or public entities, such as different governments, really dictate our future. Quite simply, we wanted to participate in the narrative as opposed to constantly resisting what was coming down the pipe. And so in being involved with the Global Maritime Forum, in discussing the different options with other stakeholders in the entire shipping supply chain, not just among our peers in the container shipping industry, but across all sectors, financial services providers, as well as shippers and government entities, agencies, and whatnot from all across the world, we felt that it was important to play a leadership role, just because this is still a very nascent area of development, especially from the shipping perspective. And so being able to wait for what is the true alternative for a decarbonized future is something we just don't have the luxury to do. And so it's still relatively early, but just in structuring the initial pilots that would utilize the different types of alternative fuels out there, and not just targeting the low-hanging fruit of alternative fuels, that is things that might be a bridge fuel for a decarbonized future, but really looking at what are the long-term options, such as ammonia, such as hydrogen, that are the things that other companies won't even consider looking at, because there is always a distinct possibility that breakthroughs can happen, and you have to start with that first step. So for us, it's participating in a lot of these initial, which are very technical pilots, and trying to come together with all the relevant stakeholders in that regard. Now, given the backdrop of what's happened over the last couple of months, which is why we're here today, we all are met with unprecedented challenges. For the context in our trade is, in several markets, we have up to almost a 40% reduction in the cargo volume that's being shipped on a year-on-year basis. If you look at the number of ships that are currently idle, I was looking over the numbers, the statistics from the end of May, and there are currently over 500 vessels that are idle, with a combined carrying capacity of 2.67 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units. And those may seem just like numbers to just amorphous numbers to most people who are watching this today. But all I have to say is these are numbers that we have never seen in our industry, even with the financial crisis to 2009 and all the different volatile markets that we've seen in the past. These numbers, in terms of the number of ships that are idle and the number of carrying capacity that is idle, has never been seen before. And then along with that, there's all the other relevant volatility in our markets, whether it has to do with fuel prices, the demand, which I referred to earlier. And so this is an extremely challenging environment where all of the operators, as far as we can see, are grappling with whether this is a new reality, whether this is a temporary situation, even if there is a recovery, how soon are we looking at that? And so the challenge is we have this very long-term problem that we still want to solve, but at the short-term basis, we have this incredible demand and operational, not just demand, but also operational challenges. Different countries have different regulations and how they facilitate the commerce that is to overcome. But I think that when it's all said and done, one of the things that this entire environment gives us is an opportunity to take a step back and look at and really think about what are the priorities that need to be met. And I think that in the last couple of weeks, as we've kind of gotten back to our own corporate normal of getting back on our feet, these priorities still remain intact. And we're seeing that in communicating with other stakeholders with the same ambition in this coalition.
Thank you, Randy. Otto, you've been a bit of an activist on this issue over the past years, and you've worked together with your partners in the shipping value chain to affect change over the past years. How are you and your company keeping up with the resolve to transition to zero-emission vessels in light of what's happening, and in light of the kind of drop in container traffic that Randy just spoke to? Can I? You're on mute still.
Sorry. Yes, Johanna, thank you, dear Minister, and other participants in this forum. Thanks for participating. Johanna, adding to what Randy just said, the drop in volumes, which we have seen right now in world trade, personally, I say this will be overcome, and we all don't know whether this is in 6 months, whether this is in 12 months or 2 years. We don't really know how quickly the economies pick up, and this will be very different by region, by trade, by commodities. But globalization will continue. Global volumes will continue to grow because world population is growing. And I think this is one key thing we all have to consider. With the growing population worldwide, consumption will continue to grow. So transportation industry has to do something about decarbonization, no matter what's happening right now with what we are seeing right now due to the economical impacts of COVID. So I'm not really, and I know for a vessel owner, of course, it's a much bigger issue right now, short term, but long term, because the pressure to do something, and we heard it from the minister, that we have to do something on climate action, and whether it's our industry decarbonizing the transport modes, whether it's planes or vessels, we have to accelerate this actually. So what the Norwegian Ship Owner Association is doing, accelerating this, becoming carbon neutral by 2050. We heard it this week, I think yesterday or day before yesterday, the CMA, the French line, announced the same thing. Maersk already announced it last year. So we are getting there. But even 2050, some people will say this is also that is too late. So we have to accelerate this even further. And we believe there are ways. We are working together with shipping lines on biofuels, and something perhaps a year ago where we thought, oh, this might be difficult. We are now seeing an increased demand for this also from customers, although this is costing more. The good news to all of us is when we are as a middleman between the customer and the hardware providers, the carriers, the container carriers, as we are selling sustainable solutions to customers, and we are telling customers this will cost more, it will not come for free, and actually the feedback is not so bad. So people are prepared to pay for this. So that's why I can only urge ship owners, shipyards to invest into this, because eventually somebody has to pay for this. And the feedback is not bad. We have seen it lately. We are starting to use now more biofuel, which is costing quite a bit more per container than the normal fuel. And we get positive feedback from customers say, yes, well, I'm willing to pay for this because I want to have ready now a zero supply chain, zero carbon supply chain. So that's the good news in this. We need better data because the differences between certain vessels, there are huge differences, of course, has to do with age and ship design, etc., etc. So also their customers are saying, please move my cargo on cleaner vessels if possible, because they all know till we are there 2050, that's still 30 years to go. And a lot of customers want a zero carbon supply chain already now if possible.
We can't hear you, Johanna.
Johanna, we can't hear you.
My apologies. There we go. That's better. This is going great. Thank you so much. It's great that you mentioned the role of the cost of the transition and the willingness of customers to pay for that transition. And I say that with some caveats because, of course, that's great on one level. But it does come at a cost, and that's part of it, and it's particularly interesting and perhaps concerning for economies that are distant. I think the minister mentioned it earlier in her opening remarks, that are where seaborne trade is a lifeline, but where we fear a cost increase. And we can get back to a little bit what those are exactly and what will be required and what the costs are. We've had some work done on that, and Randy can speak more to that as well. In the meantime, though, I'd just like to come to Gonzalo Chile is one of those countries where there's both a risk and an opportunity in shipping decarbonization, and you sit at a really, really interesting nexus. And perhaps you can speak a little bit to that nexus and why it is that you've become so actively involved in this particular issue.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you, of course, for the Getting to Zero Coalition for this opportunity. Let me try to go from general to particular. First, I need to show that how much this is relevant for the Chilean COP presidency as a follow-up of being having held the Blue COP and setting a lot of commitments, national commitments around oceans, understanding that oceans is fundamental as somehow a metric of success of our climate battle, right? Every time the oceans express in a matter of affecting regions like Martian Islands, we're failing. And at the same time, we know that the level of health of the ocean is a fundamental metric of how much we're doing it right or wrong. But at the same time, ocean is showing us so many tools. The first one being, of course, its capacity as an element, a fundamental element on nature-based solutions. We know that we need to increase those tools worldwide. We have to strengthen nature-based solutions and connect that to the health of our economies. The tool has these amazing tools that somehow we have been diminishing, and we need to change our mindset, change the way we treat the ocean in so many aspects. So in that sense, we're totally committed to the 30-30 commitment, and hoping that we will be able to definitely maintain and conserve, or do a conservancy effort on 30% of the oceans by 2030 at least. We of course understand that there are several new aspects in which the biodiversity and the health of the ocean is showing a very particular link with the climate action worldwide, being, for example, whales, one of them. We have seen how much whales can capture greenhouse emissions. Some whale can capture more than 3,000 trees at the same time. And that is not only a focus on the biodiversity of the oceans, of the health of the whales, but also that links very properly to the shipping and the maritime industry due to the particular consideration that we should take into the routes and the speed of the vessels in order to preserve the capacity of the whales not only to live, but also to capture the emissions. So there are some connections that are being somehow highlighted by the scientific community that we should be able to consider as its own, but also as it's connected to the economy worldwide and to industries such as the shipping and maritime industry. On the other hand, in Chile, we have been promoting very actively a national plan for green hydrogen. It's not only connected to our national NDCs. Remember that Chile is a long country with very strong capacities in renewable energy, not only in the north of the country due to the solar emissions, but also in the south due to the winds. That capacity that Chile has, it's underserved, of course, of the national determined contributions and the capacity of reducing the emissions of the country, but also there is a potential of Chile becoming a global producer and export of green hydrogen for the world, and that's something that is very concretely set in the plan. We're working not only with the president, but of course with the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Environment, Science, and Mining, in the sense of finding everywhere where this capacity can let Chile to become that leader. And that also takes us to aspects that our previous panelists, Randy, Lasse, and Otto brought very properly. We need a shipping and maritime industry to be developing that capacity now. I mean, it's this year the one when we have to start developing that vessel. When it comes to Chile, that is fundamental. Of course, those vessels are the vessels that we will require to sell this green fuel for the other countries. But at the same time, Chile is a country that depends on global trading. We import a lot of things, and we are mostly an exporting country of copper, wine, fruit, cellulose, and those elements will require a condition of being transported in zero emission vessels very soon. Hopefully, as we have said, at least 50% of those vessels must be zero emissions by 2050. So combining those two things, the particular strategies and the national commitments from Chile, with my role as a high-level champion working with my colleague Nigel Topping from the UK, trying to set the conditions for the success of COP26, but for the success of the climate action globally, we understand that we need to stimulate cross-industry collaboration to develop and trial zero-emission vessels, and those first vessels at a smaller scale, and then moving to deep sea ships. That means mostly that we need a roadmap to 5% of zero-emission shipping by 2030. We need to start now. This next 5 years are fundamental, as my co-panelists have just mentioned. We need those ships, at least 5% of them in the next decade, and in the next 5 years, we need a lot of them now. Of course, we need a similar work to be developed and scale on, as I said, fuel production powered by renewable energy. And in that sense, hydrogen or green hydrogen from the Chilean perspective is fundamental, as Randy highlighted. We need regulations, of course, from the IMO in line to the 1.5 pathways, and that was also very properly highlighted. And I hope that from this coalition, we'll have a group of first movers with government, shipping actors, investors, freight purchases, and fuel providers for this first larger scale rollout. So we can really focus on having at least that first 5% by 2030 as is fundamental, and we know that we can and we must make it happen. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I appreciate that. Now, you mentioned some of the policy frameworks, so that will be needed. You know, some of those can be driven at a national or regional level, but a lot of the regulation for shipping, of course, happens at the International Maritime Organization. And Minister Kabua mentioned in her opening remarks the need for a carbon tax. Lasse, can you talk a little bit about, I know in the Norwegian ship owners, you have had a lot of discussions around the role of the policy frameworks that are needed in order to drive shipping's decarbonization. Could you talk a little bit about what those are and how you see those being applied in the sector?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the whole context here is that we need to create some kind of a bridge between a societal problem and a business opportunity. And that is really where the carbon tax comes in. And we have been strong ambassadors for that for quite a while. And I think we have to just realize the hard facts. I mean, there is a reason why we have a carbon problem today. That is because carbon-based fuels are absolutely fantastic. They're easy to handle, they are cheap, they're available everywhere, there are no safety hazards to talk about. The only problem they have is that they have carbon. And if you're not willing to put a price on that carbon-based fuels will continue to win. I mean, it's a reason why we, after 2,000 years, ended up with carbon-based fuel, because it's really good with just not for the carbon. And the beauty of our industry is that we actually have a global regulator. We have IMO. No other industry I am aware of have a global regulator. So in our industry, we can actually put together a global framework on putting a price on that carbon. And that price, of course, has to be come short-term to create a fund, and we have proposed that through the ICS, an R&D fund that will fund initial scaling of technology. But eventually, that carbon price needs to be at the level where in 2030, it's profitable to order a zero-emission vessel. Sounds simple, and it's not that difficult. And then you will get the aspects, well, but that's going to be so expensive, and we can't afford it. And that's not correct. If you look on fuel prices over the last 10 years, they've been varying with $500–600 per ton. all the way down from $150 up to $750 per ton. This industry is fantastic at accommodating different energy prices, and the energy compartment of the transportation cost is very limited. So if there's willingness to pay for this, it's not going to cost the consumer too much, and it's not going to cost the customers too much. So we can definitely afford it, but no individual company can afford it themselves. No individual company have the scale to get the production of, let's say, green hydrogen at the level that we need. But collectively, through IMO, we can incentivize it. So what we ask for is IMO to put a price on carbon that makes it profitable to order zero-emission vessels by 2030.
We've heard, and I think that's great. Thank you for that strong message. I think that's very much in line with, I think, what many others who are taking a stance on this, and who are working proactively on making zero-emission vessel commercially viable in the near future. I think one thing that I would like to hear Minister Kabua's perspective on is, well, what might be the impact for small island development states, and what are the types of aspects that need to be brought into consideration when thinking about these types of policy frameworks, and what the implications might be for the Marshall Islands, for example.
Thank you, Joanna. And I just want to commend my colleagues for some of their statements, very valid points, and points that are highly relevant to all of our countries, especially us small island states. To answer your question, it is imperative, as Otto mentioned before, that we change this mindset that we have inculcated through years, that's not beneficial for our environment. Definitely, this initiative that we're championing to decarbonize our shipping industry, as well as the other major emitting industry, will be costly to small island states. We are secluded. We are we depend heavily on imported services and goods. But as I mentioned in my statement earlier, partnership is important. And if the small island states band together and come as one voice, that could be our bargaining power. So if one small island state stands alone, of course we can't do much. But as Marshalls say, one drop creates the ocean. It's important that we focus on these partnerships to defray costs that we might incur.
Thank you. You also play an interesting role as a flag state, and others. I encourage others to comment on this. One of the questions from participants in the session in the chat function is around the role of flag states in encouraging or in supporting shipping decarbonization. Are there any of you, either Minister or others, that would like to comment on the role of flag states?
If I may take a jab at that. The Marshall Islands is a flag state, and it is important, our role, to align our nation's policies and legislation to whatever we put at the regional level and at the global level. And as Lasse mentioned, as IMO is a regulator, a global regulator of the shipping industry, it's important that all of our policies and legislations are in line with the existing regional and global ones.
Okay.
If you allow me to chip in on that, Johan, I think that the most important thing a flag state can do is to ensure that we maintain the hand on the wheel is in IMO. Because the challenge now is that we see more and more regional and local developments of regulations, and that will not be helpful. And that will just lose eye on the ball that we need IMO to make global regulations. And remember, 80% of the CO2 emissions from shipping comes from deep sea shipping between continents. So it doesn't help much to only solve it within a country. The big issue is how do we solve it across countries and across regions. And that's really what the flag states should focus on. Of course, in addition to national requirements, which they are free to do as much as they want anyway.
Have you seen any loss of momentum at the IMO as over the course of these past months? What is your expectation of being able to advance in terms of putting the right policy frameworks in place? And in the absence of that, what can be done by government stakeholders to support, whether that be in terms of stimulus measures or the like? And I welcome others to chip in on that question or with answers to that question.
Was that for the minister or for me to start off?
That was for you to start with, Lasse,
yeah,
but I welcome others to chip in.
Yeah. No, I feel a bit saddened that of course, by all means, COVID hit us, but also from a decarbonization perspective, we were really coming off the start of something, I think. And to me, it was a big sign that, person of the year last year in Time magazine, that was Greta Thunberg. And I think there was something changing fundamentally on how expectations were set for the speed of change. And now, of course, when you don't have sessions and IMO cannot meet physically and so on, this will affect progress. Let's face it. But I think the urgency is there. And what I like is now that bodies like EU and others really now say, okay, we're not going to put stimulus into the economy, make sure we put in green stimulus. So I think it has turned out from becoming a big problem, COVID, for decarbonization talks, now actually to represent a little bit of an opportunity. But no doubt the discussions in IMO due to physical limitations have slowed down time being.
If I would like to add something on the cost again, what I mentioned earlier, and also, and I can only support, and some people, some carriers might not like this. We favor very much a carbon tax because eventually that will put even more pressure. Number one, it would support the investment into helping ocean carriers, shipping lines to come up with new technologies faster, because as I said, somebody has to pay for this. If we take a carbon tax, a ton of CO2, and there are all kinds of ideas floating around, depends what countries. I think in Sweden, they have one of the highest carbon taxes. Switzerland has a very high one. But if you take 20, 30, 40, $50 a ton of CO2, and you bring this down to the container being shipped, and if you consider today a container being shipped around the world, depending which trade lane, what kind of vessels you take, you talk between half a ton of CO2 to 1.5 tons of CO2 per container. So you talk 50, 60, 70, $80 more per container. Freight rates today are fluctuating by hundreds of dollars up and down. No shipper has a concern to pay $50, $80 more per container if it would be a carbon neutral solution. So, and even if we ship to the Marshall Islands, the container, I don't know, from New Zealand, from Australia might cost shipping a container with meat or whatever, what goes to the islands, $3,000, $4,000 on a reefer container. Whether we pay $4,000, $4,100 will have no effect on globalization of trade. So the cost per ton of CO2 in comparison to is so small, and that's why that's what we're seeing, and that's what we are selling, and that's what we are explaining to a lot of shippers. We're actually getting a lot of questions from shippers saying, so why is it not coming all much faster?
I think I hope there are many of the representatives at the IMO that are listening to the session today, or can be encouraged to come back to it at a later stage. Gonzalo, did you want to make a remark?
Yeah, if I can just jump into that. Not being a specialist on the maritime industry, what makes me realize the relevance of this conversation is also that this discussion is happening in other industries, in other regions, in other sectors. So it would be important to also set the conditions not only internally through the IMO, through the different actors of the maritime industry, but how do we connect this to the conversation, the broader conversation that is happening in the financial industry, and how much of that conversation that Otto is explaining properly brings this industry to potentially having better interest rates in their loans, or in their capacity of interacting with the financial industry. So it's important when we see the broader picture to see all of those interrelations, because this conversation is fundamental to be heard by the other sectors in order for all of them also to mobilize faster. So I not only appreciate, I celebrate, but also it's important to set these bridges, and how much of this conversation is totally related to the climate justice and to the capacity of really moving forward with our global commitment on resilience and adaptation, also with the small island states. So it's not an independent discussion. It has to be connected as well to the others, because that connection will help us solve the whole and not only focus on the individual.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make, and I think I'd like to come back to Randy on this actually, because it's one of the founding tenets of the Getting to Zero Coalition, is this idea of connecting all the different parts, not only of the maritime value chain, but the energy value chain, the financial value chains, and figuring out the solutions together. Because not only within the maritime value chain, but connecting it up with other, as you mentioned previously, Gonzalo, in your remarks, with whether it's the mining sector or others, we are likely going to be looking to develop similar fuels, that it's the same fuels that are likely going to be used in other sectors as well. And there's a real opportunity to work together. Randy, I don't know if you would like to build on that in terms of what's required.
Yeah, I think that the earlier comments that Lasse had referred to, the important role of the IMO with regards to creating the right type of incentives, is extremely important. And we have an example that we can point to a very recent example, which is the IMO 2020 regulation on low sulfur fuels. Doesn't have anything to do with decarbonization, but has everything to do with the reduction of sulfur oxide emissions. And that was something that was enforced across the industry. But it was caveated in that there was a stipulation that for some jurisdictions that couldn't source the fuel, you could use alternatives such as scrubbers to be compliant. And to be honest, it was a poorly written regulation. It was something that was negotiated in the IMO as a way to appease laggards. And as a result, you had tremendous amounts of investment into scrubber installations, some which are still going on right now. And to be honest, from a commercial perspective, it no longer is relevant because the price of fuel has crashed over the last 3 months. Now, of course, it could rebound and you'd have some more stratification within the final refined product. But the key point here is you need to have an active private public sector dialogue about how to create the proper incentives, transparent incentives, incentives that are relevant to getting us to the objectives that we want to achieve. For us, it isn't enough just to have a decarbonized supply chain. It needs to be truly a green supply chain, right? A lot of what we're talking about now in terms of biofuels, quite honestly, are brown supply chain alternatives, and green alternatives, truly green alternatives, are still many years in the making, not just from a technical feasibility perspective, but also in terms of the long-term scale that is necessary to make it actually something that everyone collectively benefits over the long run. I'm not bringing these up on purpose in terms of like saying it's challenging. We all know the problem is challenging. It's more just the complexity of what needs to come together. And the first starting point is truly these pilot projects, which whether they're happening in the Baltics or they're happening in, potentially in Southeast Asia, in Australia, bringing together countries like Morocco, as well as what Gonzalo referenced in terms of Chile. And again, these are cross-regional, not just like cross-border, but cross-regional partnerships that have to happen between stakeholders to be able to test the limits of what's possible, and then going back and iterate upon the regulatory framework that creates the proper incentives. I noticed that there was one of the questions is how far are we with having a zero emission vessel on the water? To be honest, we're a couple of years away from putting vessels on the water, but we are several decades away from putting scalable solutions on the water. And that's really the question that needs to be answered. It isn't enough just to have one vessel or two vessels saying we can do it. It's really about how do we get the alternative fuels from the source transported, bunkered on the vessels, and then the vessels utilize them to bring cargo from A to B all throughout the world at a scale that moves the needle. And so whether you're undertaking these ambitious targets, but really not just in terms of just issuing press releases, but really engaging in active pilots and bringing together stakeholders, that's where we see what getting to zero really means, and where there are first movers and different subsets of that group, and trying to have this active dialogue among the private sector as well as the public sector.
Thank you, Randy. Before I go, I'm going to ask Gonzalo just one last question before we wrap this up. We've heard quite a bit about the private sector calling for, and the minister calling for policy frameworks in the context of the IMO, but also in that sort of the kinds of policy frameworks that are needed in order to drive shipping decarbonization. You're in a really interesting place where you're looking to COP26. You mentioned your collaboration with Nigel Topping, who's a champion for COP26 and international climate negotiations, to take place towards the end of next year. What would you like to see from this sector? And I'm sorry, I'm dropping this on you. I know it wasn't in your prepared questions, but what would you think would be helpful as we look towards that timeline from the sector? What do you need from the sector in order to really make big leaps forward at a global level?
I think the capacity of realism that Randy explained is fundamental. So we need to know where we're standing actually, but at the same time, everything that you all mentioned and the vision that Lasse also mentioned, it's fundamental to see where we need to be. In that sense, we need the SpaceX of this industry. I mean, we see what had just happened in the previous days in terms of what our technological capacity, our capacity of really relating to the governments in order to reach amazing goals, even things that were not in our map some years ago. I'm absolutely sure, and I'm speaking on a technical basis as well, that we can do it. We can have the first vessels in the next 5 years, and we can have 5% of the shipping industry moved by clean fuels by 2030. In order to have that, we need to see the first piloting, and not only pilot of the vessel, but also the first pilot of the whole value chain being shown at COP26. We need to see that. And you are fundamental not only as relevant actors in that chain, but you can pull that demand very rapidly. And therefore, it's of course a fundamental conversation with the IMO, how much you're willing to lead not only the industry, but you want to lead the climate action globally, because we all depend, all of our industries depend on a maritime industry. As Otto mentioned, world's going to continue to be global. And therefore, we need you, as you need also the other industries to be integrated in this solution. We know it can be possible, and we need to see that at the first pilots next year in COP26.
Thank you, Gonzalo. With that, I will bring the session to a close. If there are any questions that didn't get answered, we will certainly take them into our discussions within the context of the Getting to Zero Coalition going forward, and that can inform our work as we move forward with the coalition. I think one of the things that a discussion like this one makes clear is how much we can do by working together, and how, whether it's governments, international organizations, the private sector, to make shipping decarbonization a reality, and to really move this agenda forward, and to make real progress. And to Randy's point, that it's not about just press releases, but making actual progress with real projects on water, on land, etc. I look forward to working together with all of you on that going forward, and to creating a much more sustainable future for us, for the oceans. With that, I just wish to close out by thanking Friends of Ocean Action and the World Economic Forum for the opportunity to host this session, and to our esteemed panel for their time, and especially to all of you who joined us here today. Thank you, and look forward to speaking more soon.